I'd like to welcome everyone to today's presentation on Sandoval County veterans. This was part of a 2-year effort to document and collect photographs on all the veterans from the beginning in the Civil War through the Indian War era, the Spanish-American War, Mexican Punitive Expedition, World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. In total, we documented over 5,700 veterans that were residents at Sandoval County at some point in their lives, born here, raised here, or moved here to becoming a resident after their period of service to our country. We also captured approximately 1,600 photographs that are displayed on 34 panels located in the atrium of the Sandoval County Administration Building, which is located at 528 and Idalia in Rio Rancho. It's a 3-story building there. It's a very impressive memorial, and it gives you the opportunity to see all these veterans in uniform as at the time that they served our nation. With that said, we will go into the presentation. But for those who want to know a little bit more about myself, the narrator, I'm Colonel David C. Baca, U.S. Army retired. I served approximately 33 years in the Armed Forces. My last assignment was as a Deputy Director for Command Control and Communications for United States Joint Forces Command, headquartered in Norfolk, Virginia. It was a multi-branch service command. We had Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, which probably makes me ideally suited to be involved in this presentation because I treat every branch equally in the documentary. With that said, I would invite everyone to stand, and we will begin by honoring the flag of the United States of America. Veterans, present arms. Veterans, order, arms. I'd like to begin with giving credits to organizations and institutions that whose assistance this would not have been made possible. First of all, it's the New Mexico State Records Center and Archives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is the source of many photographs as well as military service records on these veterans. The National Archives of the United States in Washington, D.C., for their archives having to do with pension and service records from the Civil War, Indian Wars, and other eras as well. The Historical Society of New Mexico, which funded in part the panels that are on display at the Sandoval County Administration Building. The Sandoval County Historical Society, where we are today for the filming of this presentation, for their tireless support of this effort for the past 2 years. We have several individuals that need to be recognized. First, Florence McCoy of Cuba, New Mexico, who worked tirelessly to gather photographs and war stories of veterans from the northwestern part of the county, that being Cuba, La Jara, Torreon, Ojo Encino, and Regina, and the other communities up in the northwest section. We have Lorraine Dominguez Stubblefield, who assisted with gathering photographs and war stories in Bernalillo, Placitas, Algodones, and parts of Rio Rancho. And we have a host of other participants, volunteers, such as Avelino Calabaza from Santo Domingo, Benny Bernal from Peña Blanca, Felix Lucero from Cochiti Pueblo, Jerome Lucero from Zia Pueblo, Jose Garcia from Cañón de Jemez, Lana Valencia Lucero from San Felipe Pueblo, Silvia Saiz from Zia Pueblo, Thomas Larry Pecos from Jemez Pueblo, Virginia Rivera Ortiz from Sile, and Wayne Sandoval from Placitas, all of whom were of immense importance to this project for their efforts, their time and efforts in helping to identify veterans and gather their photos and war stories. I also like to recognize Philip Rios, the county manager for Sandoval County, and the Sandoval County Commission for agreeing to permanently display this wonderful memorial in the atrium of the Sandoval County Administration Building, a place where it gets very, very high visibility, which is fabulous. Don't have the words to thank them so much for what they've done. I'd also like to recognize Federico Reed, PhD, who's a cinema photographer for this project. With that said, we go into the presentation. We begin with understanding that Sandoval County, as it exists today, was different back in the day at the time of the Civil War. It was actually part of two separate counties, Bernalillo County and Santa Ana County, the boundaries of which extended all the way to the border of California and the Colorado River. What we know as Las Vegas, Nevada today was actually part of Santa Ana County, the county seat of which was in Peña Blanca, Sandoval County, New Mexico. So, you know, they were very, very large counties back in the day. And our veterans that are represented come from that era, that great distance in documenting this information and history. We begin first with Lieutenant Colonel Nasario Gonzales, who was born in Corrales, New Mexico in about 1816. He'd be raised there, go into business in Bernalillo with Jose Leandro Perea and with the Perea and Sons mercantile business. He would be the owner and operator of their store up in Santa Fe. Now he would marry Maria Rita Baki Delgado of La Cienega, and she was descending of the family that owned and operated El Rancho de las Golondrinas, which today is a living museum of the Spanish and Mexican colonial period here in New Mexico. You can go there and you can walk in the very rooms where Nasario lived and raised his family and cuddled his grandchildren and so forth. He was a rancher, a merchant, and as well as owner of the Gonzales mining district in the Cerrillos Hills. There was actually 3 districts there, and he owned one of them. And their center of operations there was in a town that was referred to as Bonanza at the time. Now shown on the slide, you see his portrait as well as his commission as a lieutenant colonel in the militia of the territory of New Mexico, signed by then Governor Henry Connolly. The next veteran we recognize, for whom we have a picture of, is Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Perea. Now he was actually born in Los Padillas, which is in the South Valley of what we know as Albuquerque today. But as a very young boy, the family moved and established themselves in Corrales, where he would be raised. They would also eventually acquire lands in Bernalillo, and the family members would descend from both branches in Bernalillo and in Corrales. Now he would organize a battalion during the Civil War for the New Mexico Territory, referred to as Perea's Battalion. Now they came from up and down the Rio Grande Valley, from as far north as Peña Blanca and Algodones, all the way south to Los Lunas and Belen. They were very significant in terms of their military actions throughout the Civil War here, and that would help to propel him to become the New Mexico's territorial delegate to Congress. Now it was during his service in Congress back during the Civil War that he would be a participant or observer, I should say, in one of the historic events of our nation, that being the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. He happened to be seated in Ford's Theater next to the president's box when Booth took it upon himself to assassinate the president. And I've shown in the screen here on the slide is a depiction in a newspaper from that period of Booth shooting President Lincoln, and then jumping from the president's box down onto the floor of the stage. Now, in that second picture, the artist from the time depicts a gentleman standing next to the president's box, watching the events that are unfolding. That would be Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Perea. Also shown is the pistol which Booth used to assassinate the president. We have other veterans as well from the Civil War period, like Sgt Rafael Martinez. He was born in 1834 on a ranch near Regina. He saw duty at Fort Union until February of 1862, combat action at the Battle of Valverde, and then was involved in the pursuit of Confederate forces from April 13th to 22nd when they were retreating from the territory of New Mexico. He would then go on to serve briefly in Central and Santa Fe districts until May 1862 when he was discharged. Shown here is his pension record. We also have Corporal Santos Cebada. He served under Colonel Kit Carson during the Civil War and was with the cavalry that destroyed the Confederate supply train at the Battle of Valverde. He would then go on to serve at Fort Stanton in what would become known as the Mescalero Apache Campaign. And he would then be discharged and he would move to an area referred to as Old Fort San Pablo, which is about 5 miles southwest of Cuba, New Mexico, where he would acquire a ranch and homestead the land, build a home and a chapel. It's now a bed and breakfast referred to as Sueños Encantados y Casa Vieja, which you're certainly welcome to go by and visit, tour, and spend a night in. He is buried there on the property, as shown in the slide. You see his tombstone there from the Civil War, as well as his portrait and his service records from that period. It wasn't just the service members or the soldiers that were affected by the events of the Civil War. The civilian population up and down the Rio Grande Valley was affected as well. Because of the destruction of the Confederate supply train at the Battle of Valverde, they saw no alternative course but to sack and loot the homesteads and businesses that they encountered as they marched north through Socorro, Belen, Las Lunas, Albuquerque, Bernalillo, and so forth up through Algodones. Now, this was not random looting. The Confederate soldiers were working under the direct written orders of their senior commanders. Shown here on the slide is an actual image of one of these handwritten orders written by Lieutenant Colonel William R. Scurry of the Confederate Army. It's addressed to John Tardy, and it gives him the authorization to search for and seize whatever items they felt were necessary. This could have been sacks of wheat, it could have been a barrel of whiskey, it could be a wagon with horses that would draw it, it could be clothing. They took all manner of items that they deemed necessary to supply their army as they marched north to reconstitute the supplies that they had lost at the Battle of Valverde. This was not always a clear cut. There was some shop owners who, when the Confederates barged into their stores, would claim that they were Southern sympathizers. Why were they going to destroy them and their livelihoods? So the Confederates would stop and ask them, well then, who are the Union sympathizers? And these shop owners would point out amongst their neighbors who were Union supervisors, so the Confederate soldiers would leave them alone and pillage their neighbors' properties. This was all fine and well as long as the Confederate Army was here, but when they retreated from New Mexico, it came back to haunt them because they knew that their neighbors would take retribution. So they had no recourse but to load whatever they could on a wagon and exit the state, trailing the Confederate Army as they departed for Texas, leaving behind all their shops, their homes, and everything else that they had that they could not carry with them. Now, There was another event, an untold story associated with this civilian depredation that took place up and down the Rio Grande Valley. And that was the actions by the pueblos of San Felipe, Santo Domingo, and Cochiti. They had heard of what was happening to the south, and they were prepared to fight to defend their villages to prevent the Confederate Army from sacking them. So they joined forces, and they had a show of force south of San Felipe as the Confederates began to march north from Algodones. The Confederates would wisely choose to avoid combat action with them. They would veer to the east and go up north to Santa Fe from a more easternly approach to Santa Fe, as opposed to attempting to go through the pueblos. Their forces would then begin to shadow the Confederate Army. If they were to turn to raid their pueblos, they would lure them into arroyos and what have you, where they had ambushes prepared ahead of time from which they could inflict maximum casualties on the Confederates. They also had a reserve of warriors available to them that could launch a counterattack at the point of their choosing, should the Confederates attempt to raid their villages. Why, might you ask, why the Confederate Army, armed with artillery and the arms that they had, would choose to avoid action? Well, the commander, Colonel Sibley of the Confederate forces, had served in the Southwest before the Civil War. He was well aware of the history of events that had transpired when the U.S. Army had gotten into skirmishes with Native Americans. The most notable being there were riots up in Taos where then Governor Bent was murdered. They would send 2 squadrons from Fort Marcy and Santa Fe thinking, well, we'll just put this down in a heartbeat, only to find that they would suffer nearly 33% casualties. They lost like 68, 69 soldiers out of their 200 in attempting to put down the rebellion in Taos. Colonel Sibley could ill afford to incur those types of casualties to his Confederate force. He needed every soldier to fight the Union Army. So he would wisely avoid contact with the pueblos who were attempting to blockade any effort to pillage their pueblos. This action on their part, in their language, is referred to as Chayawashan, or the Pueblo blockade. My ancestors come from Blanca. They were protected by this umbrella that the Indians had put up to prevent the Confederate Army from attacking their towns, and is passed down both in the oral tradition in my family as well as in the Native American communities. This story is told, and we tell it today for the greater population and benefit of all to know that they too had a role in the Civil War. Shown here on the picture is Jose H. Hilario Montoya in 1880, who would go on to become governor of Cochiti. We show the governor of Santo Domingo, 1883, and Jose Cuivera, who would go on to become governor of San Felipe Pueblo in 1879, all 3 of whom were veterans of the Pueblo blockade that I speak to. This now takes us to the next era, which is the Indian Wars. And it spans a period from 1861 all the way through 1895 in the life and times of the residents of Sandoval County. In the early period, and we would identify approximately 153 Pueblo, Jicarilla, Apache, and Navajo Native Americans from Sandoval County who would distinguish themselves as U.S. Army Scouts from 1861 well into the 1890s. Now, unlike Hollywood depictions where they show 2 or 3 with a regiment of Union forces, no, there was typically far more. They numbered in far greater numbers, sometimes representing as much as 1/3 of the fighting force. If you had a squad that had been deployed, there might be 6 uniformed regular soldiers and 3 scouts. If 150 soldiers had deployed on some action, as many as 1/3 of those, upwards of 50, 52, could very well be scouts. So they were a very significant factor in all the battles and engagements that took place during the period of their service. It's also important to note that the Scouts would undertake the most daring of operations with utmost stealth deep into hostile territory to gather intelligence, to capture or kidnap an individual, a key individual, to execute some form of sabotage to the enemy forces that they were going up against. That mission is akin to the mission of the United States Army Special Forces today. Actually, the insignia that the U.S. Army Special Forces today wear is the crossed arrows, one and the same as the U.S. Army Scouts from back in the day, because they recognized the mission is almost literally identical. The difference being is that today they deploy on helicopters and parachute out of aircraft, whereas back then they were on horseback. It's also important to note that they were performed, like in the case of Geronimo, Hollywood shows us or depicts regular soldiers capturing him. Not so. It was the Scouts that would capture him and bring him to the regular forces. And they were combat soldiers. At least 10 that we've identified would earn the Congressional Medal of Honor in direct combat for their services. Now, they would be paid between $13 to $15 a month, which is the same pay as cavalry soldiers, and they were entitled to pensions when Congress authorized pensions for the service members of the Indian Wars era. Now, if we look at how active they were, it's a wide window there from 1861 all the way to the mid-1890s. If we just pick the middle, like in this case, 1880, we can get an understanding of just how active they were. Because we find there was as many as 27 separate combat actions in the territory of New Mexico during that period. They were involved in a battle at the Rio Puerco in the San Mateo Mountains, as shown on the slide, San Andreas Mountains, and at Pumpkin Creek, in the Sacramento Mountains, and in La Luz, at Blazer's Mill, and at Dog Canyon, in South Fork and Pato Springs, Membrillo Canyon and Kelly's Ranch, Palomas River, Old Fort Tularosa, and so on and so forth. They were not garrison soldiers sitting around the fort just grooming their horses. They were constantly deployed and involved in numerous engagements. Now, if we look at the Indian Wars period, throughout everything that occurred west of the Mississippi, you'll find that over 1/3 of the battles took place in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico, the Southwest, the areas bordering Mexico. Over 1/2 of the battle engagements, as compared to other states such as Oregon, Wyoming, and Oklahoma. Actually, New Mexico alone had as many battle engagements as Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Idaho combined. And why is this? Well, most historians state it's because the Native American population in the Southwest was more pernicious. They were determined to defend their lands to the bitter end. Consequently, that is why we have such a high number of battle engagements here in the Southwest, and it would span such a long period of time. In 1861, the first troop would be organized. There was 49 volunteers, and they came from all the various pueblos, as far away as Taos Pueblo, San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, Picuris, Isleta Pueblo, Laguna Pueblo, all the pueblos of Sandoval County, Zia, Jemez, Santa Ana, and so forth. And how do we know this? Well, on the muster roll, that is the document they signed when they were being organized, we can just look at their surnames. Names like Armijo and Calabaza, Chavez and Chinana, Fragua and Garvizu, Quintana and Sarcino, and Waki. Well, Fraguas and Chinanas come from Jemez Pueblo. Calabaza, you only find it in Santo Domingo. Garvisu would be San Felipe. So we can identify them to pueblos by their surnames because those surnames continue to this day. And they would be in the service of the United States Army, shown there is a picture of them with their arms in hand. We also have Navajo U.S. Army Scouts who would participate as well. They began fighting for the United States Army in 1873. They would be organized out of Fort Wingate, which is near Gallup, New Mexico. They saw action fighting victorious Apache braves at, for example, the 1877 Battle of the Florida Mountains, and in the 1879 battle at Las Animas Creek, where 2 were killed in action, as well as many, many, many other battles. Shown here in the picture are some of those Navajo Scouts. On this slide, we see close-ups or portrait pictures of 3, Ata Kai Bin Zui and Charlie Mitchell in the first photograph. Navajo names were very difficult to pronounce, that the vast majority were given aliases like Sombrero Grande, Sombrero Viejo, Delgadito, or Calladito. Names that continue, these are surnames that continue to this day in the Navajo Nation. They couldn't just pronounce their Navajo names. They were very difficult language to master. That's why the code talkers of World War II fame were so successful, because of the nature of their language. The Japanese just were unable to crack it. And also shown here is another scout called Largo, obviously, because you can see how tall he is. And he's there with Captain Ben Rogers at Fort Wingate in 1885. Now, through the course of looking through all these pension records and registers during the Indian War period to identify Sandoval County's veterans, I came across a transaction of a woman. And being of Hispanic ancestry myself and having served 33 years in the military, I knew immediately that this was an extraordinary finding, because women did not begin to serve openly as women in the United States military until 1901, when they created the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, and in 1908 with the Navy Nurse Corps. It wouldn't be until World War II, with the creation of the WACs, the WAVES, and so forth, that even more women would serve in uniform, but in support capacities. So I was just amazed to find it. And I thought, well, one record's not going to be enough. I have to find a secondary source that supports this. And sure enough, as I was going through the registers of the 20th Regiment of the United States Infantry, lo and behold, as you see on the slide there, the third name down on the list is Mexicana Chiquito. And it shows that she was age 24 at the time of her enlistment at Fort Wingate. Well, one of the things that tells us is that she was born in 1862, which sheds a tremendous amount of light on her personal story. Because she would have been a 3-year-old child during the tragic long walk of the Navajo from their homelands there in far western New Mexico and present-day Arizona, all the way to Rio Puercos, to Bosque Redondo, where they were confined onto a small reservation there. And this occurred in the dead of winter, under harsh winter conditions. As a 3-year-old, she had to endure that long walk. Now, there was many who would die along that walk. It is said that there was several hundred whose bodies would unfortunately litter the path that they followed from Fort Defiance area all the way to Bosque Redondo. But she would manage to survive that and then endure 4 or 5 grueling years there at Bosque Redondo. When they arrived there, there was no shelter for them. They literally had to dig holes in the ground and cover them with grass and thatch in order to escape the elements of the winter, the winds and what have you. If we go forward in time to World War II, when the United States imprisoned Japanese citizens, They were sent to camps like Minidoka in Idaho and Manzanar in Southern California. They had barracks for them, no insulation, just a thin tar paper on the outside, very basic accommodations, but at least they had something that the Navajo had nothing when they got there to Bosque Redondo. And there simply wasn't enough materials there available in the bosques along the Rio Puercos to construct quarters, living quarters for themselves. So it was very harsh conditions. They would suffer dysentery there as well because there's a lot of alkali in the waters of the Rio Puerco Rio Pecos in that area. And as a result, it caused a lot of illness too, as well amongst their citizens. Now, when they were expected to become self-sufficient there, but unfortunately the soil there had a lot of alkali and it was very poor for agriculture. So they could not raise enough food for themselves. Compounding that is the fact that when they estimated the number of Navajos that they were going to incarcerate there at Bosque Redondo, they underestimated by at least 2,000. So to begin with, any rations that they had to begin with at the beginning of their incarceration there was insufficient to feed the population. Then you add on top of that the corruption and the graft amongst the traders before the food actually got delivered to the Native Americans. They suffered greatly. They were very, very much malnourished during their stay there. Now, the Civil War would end. General Sherman would become of Civil War fame, the one who burned Atlanta and so forth, would become commander of the army in the West, and he would go on a tour of the various forts. And when he arrived at Fort Sumner, which was the fort associated with Bosque Redondo, he was absolutely appalled at the conditions that the Navajo were having to live under there. And he had seen some terrible atrocities and conditions like Andersonville in Georgia during the Civil War, and yet he was just so appalled by what he found there. And he would immediately set in course the actions by which the Navajo would be allowed to return to their homeland. So now Mexicana Chiquito, as a 7-8-year-old child, would have to make the long walk back to Navajo country. Now, each family was given 2 sheep. And the expectation is that they would then breed and multiply, and that would be their subsistence into the future. Well, that's 350 miles with just 2 sheep. How are you going to survive? The chiefs, their leaders, knowing that they were going to suffer greatly if they ate them, pleaded with all their people to not eat the sheep. So they had to survive eating the roots of bushes and other vegetation from Bosque Redondo all the way back to their homeland. Now, when they got back to their homeland, they found utter devastation because the U.S. Army had destroyed all their homes. Their croplands were overgrown with brush. Their orchards had been chopped down and so forth. So it was very desperate times. The other situation they had to contend with is that they had lost essentially two generations of their menfolk fighting the United States Army before they were marched off to Bosque Redondo. The demographics of the population was totally out of balance. As a matter of necessity, out of survival for the people, they began to train women to track and hunt to help bring in food, game, to sustain their people. Now, Mexicana Chiquito would have been one of the women who was trained to track and hunt. Now, she would become extremely proficient in that and becoming what one might consider to be the Annie Oakley of the Navajo Nation. In 1886, there was a group of braves that were headed to Fort Wingate to try for a chance at becoming scouts. Well, she would join them. They would arrive at Fort Wingate, and to the amazement of the commander and the sergeants there, they see this woman in their group, and they says, "What, a woman? What are they thinking?" And Fortunately, one of the braves spoke up and says, well, if she can beat you and your men, will you sign her up? And he arrogantly said, oh, of course, like there was any chance of that happening. So they would put her to the test in terms of her marksmanship and her horsemanship and other skills that they expected the scouts to have. And she just passed every test they threw at her. And true to his word then, on May 24th, 1886, he would enlist her into the United States Army as a U.S. Army Scout. And she thus enters the history books as the first known woman to serve openly as a woman in the history of the armed forces of the United States. Now, one of the braves, seeing that she's made it, jumps on his horse, and he returns 2 days later with another who will go down in the history books as Muchacha. And she will be put to the test and will pass everything that they can throw at her. And she too is entered on the register there. Just 2 lines below Mexicana Chiquito, or 3 lines, you'll see Muchacha's name there. Now she was 3 years younger than Mexicana Chiquito, which tells us that she was in her mother's womb when the mother had to make the long walk from Navajo country to Bosque Redondo, and would be raised as an infant in a hole in the ground there at Fort Sumner in Bosque Redondo. Understanding that there would potentially be critics, doubting Thomases regarding this finding, I would ask Senator Tom Udall, the senior U.S. Senator from New Mexico, if he could ask the United States National Archives to review the finding. And he did, and since the request was coming from a United States Senator, they did it like that. They jumped right on it. I, as a private citizen sending it up there, it might take a year if they even bothered to do it, you know. But coming from a U.S. Senator, they would review it and certify everything that I have shared here with you as to their validity of their service in the U.S. Army Scouts. Shown here on the slide is the letter addressed to the Honorable Tom Udall from the National Archives. It's signed by Trevor Plant, who happens to be the chief of the Archives Research Branch there. So this is not an underling in the archives signing this, authenticating it. It's the chief of the branch, one of the senior officials there with the archives. This past May as a result of this, marked the 130th anniversary of their service, certified by the National Archives. It is my hope and my prayer that they will be fully recognized in American history for the landmark event of their service to our nation. Now keep in mind, they were not just soldiers, like as a cook or a clerk or a wagon master. They were combat soldiers as U.S. Army Scouts. Now it isn't until this year, 2016, that Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter would lift a restriction on women serving in combat line positions. Now, and it was on all the national news when this occurred, a big hoopla, but we come to find that there was this event in history, these 2 Native American women who became the first women to serve openly, not only the first women, but the first they served as combat soldiers, and add to that the fact that they were U.S. Army Scouts, which makes them special forces, that what we're noting here and documenting, honoring here today, is America's first G.I. Janes, if you want to use the title given to that movie that Demi Moore made several years back when she went through training to be a Navy SEAL. So it's just absolutely extraordinary. There would be a photographer in the West who was wanting to photograph all the great chiefs and what have you, and he was in Navajo country, and to photograph Manuelito and other great chiefs of the Navajo. And he was wanting to photograph their greatest braves, and asking who that might be. They responded, well, that would be the bear hunters. And they said, sure, you know, they would ask them to gather, and they did. And the bear hunters would invite 2 women to sit in on that portrait photo with them. Now, the photographer would not document their names, but we look at this picture because, you know, back in the day, women could not vote. There was a lot of male chauvinism. I don't need to go down that path. We all understand that women were not equal back in that, at least all in the 1880s. So he just dismissed even recording their names on there. But the fact that there's 2 and not 3, that there's 2 and not 1 in the picture, attests to the fact that this could very well be those 2 scouts who would have been held in very high esteem in the Navajo Nation for their having become U.S. Army Scouts. Now keep in mind, it was very competitive. If we can look at a one after action report by Lieutenant Henry Wright in 1877, he speaks to how he went into Navajo country and he enlisted 21 scouts out of a group of about 100 that had presented themselves. What does that tell us? Well, the Army was being very selective, that only 1 in 5 would meet the criteria to become a scout. Now, the fact that these 2 women had not only become scouts in their own right as women, they also had to be better than 4 out of 5 of the men that were trying, just attest to how extraordinary and legendary their service and their character would have been back in that day. And we can gain an appreciation how these great braves of the Navajo Nation would have held them in high esteem and invited them to pose in the picture with them. Here again, here's another picture of the Navajo Scouts in 1885. You can see them with all their rifles drawn in formation. And if we look to the background of the picture, you see yet another echelon of scouts. Very formidable, very impressive array of fighting soldiers there. Into the Spanish-American War era, and we would have 3 residents from Sandoval County. Actually, they came from Bland, which is now a ghost town. It was a mining community northwest up in the from Peña Blanca up in the Jemez Mountains. Now they would join the Rough Riders, serving under Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, who would go on to become President of the United States. Interestingly, 2 of the 3, that being Thomas Phepps and William Wood, would actually serve in Troop G, which is critically important to the story of future President Roosevelt, in that they are the troop that would engage in his first combat action there in Cuba at the Battle of Las Guasimas. Now, interestingly, he actually takes personal command of that troop for whatever reason. It ends up being a victory. You know, they defeat the Spanish at Las Guasimas, handing him his first combat victory. Now, this is critical because had they lost that battle, his perspective on the war, his go-getter attitude could very well have been dramatically effective. He could have become much more conservative in his approach to deploying his forces against the Spanish. Being a victory, that just charged him up. And from Las Guasimas, they would go on, and it's shown here on the slide. You can see the fire burst there where the Battle of Las Guasimas took place, to engage the Spanish at San Juan Hill. Now there's actually 2 hills there. There's San Juan Hill and there's Kettle Hill. And contrary to the myth, Theodore Roosevelt actually assaulted Kettle Hill. The 1st Division of the United States Army attacked San Juan Hill. And they got about halfway up the hill and got bogged down and couldn't go any further. The Spanish had them pinned down. That's when Theodore Roosevelt would receive orders from the higher commander to attack Kettle Hill, to launch a supporting attack. Now, fresh off their victory at Las Guasimas, they were just highly motivated, and they charged up that Kettle Hill, the Rough Riders together with the Buffalo Soldiers, and they would not stop for nothing, even though the Spanish were bombarding them in a hail of gunfire. And they made it to the top and kicked the Spanish off of Kettle Hill, and they began to reorganize them there. It's at that point that Colonel Roosevelt turns and he can see for the first time the predicament of the 1st Division on San Juan Hill. Now, without any orders from his superior commander, he took his own initiative and turned his entire regiment 90 degrees and attacked San Juan Hill. And this overwhelmed the Spanish because they were not expecting an attack from their flank. Now, the 1st Division, seeing that the Rough Riders were attacking from the flank, gave an extra effort, and they were successful in getting up the rest of the San Juan Hill, and together they would knock the Spanish off San Juan Hill, which was a huge victory for them. It was very key terrain. It's an action that would lead to President Roosevelt receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions there that day. Now, from San Juan Hill, as you can see on the slide, their artillery could rain fire down on the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor. And this was a showstopper for the Spanish. They had no choice but to raise anchor and attempt to exit Santiago Harbor. Now, waiting for them offshore, off at sea there, was the U.S. naval blockade. And they ran straight into that as they were exiting Santiago Harbor, and the U.S. Navy would sink, all their ships. It was just a huge naval victory for the U.S. Navy. Now, amongst the sailors there would be Petty Officer Robert Thomason of Regina, Sandoval County. He was serving there with the fleet off the coast of southern Cuba there and participated in that great naval victory. As a result of that naval victory, together with their defeating the Spanish at San Juan Hill, it would lead the Spanish to parley, to negotiate, and within weeks the war would come to an end. We have one other Spanish-American War veteran. His name is Samuel Houston. He would live in Rio de los Vacas, which is a hamlet of Cuba, New Mexico. And he was actually living in Tennessee at the time when he was drafted, serving at Camp Dewey, which is near Nashville, Tennessee. In fact, the war ended so quickly that he never actually deployed to Cuba. The end result, he would be discharged and he'd come out west, and interestingly, he would settle in Cuba, New Mexico. He was determined to end up in a Cuba somewhere, if anywhere. Ended up being in New Mexico. You see his tombstone there. He's buried there on his ranch there in Cuba. Another one of our veterans of the Spanish-American War period. This leads us now into the Mexican Punitive Expedition era, where we had 2 residents who would participate in combat operations that attempted unsuccessfully to capture Pancho Villa. Now, one of these 2 was Elijah McLean Fenton. Everyone would refer to him as Mac Fenton. He's the one, he was from Jemez Springs up in the Jemez Mountains. He's the individual from whom Fenton Lake up in the mountains is named after. Beautiful setting. His father had homesteaded that area. He would grow up there and enter the service from there. He would also go on to serve in World War I. Also is Frank Padilla of Peña Blanca, who would serve in the Punitive Expedition. Now, neither actually went into Mexico. They were involved in activities there at Columbus, New Mexico. First and foremost, they were building refugee camps to deal with the influx of thousands of Mexicans that were fleeing the fighting in Old Mexico. You can see pictures of one of the refugee camps there. You see the Mexicans kept bringing what little possessions they could carry with them north into the United States. They also built clinics so that they could be given vaccinations and shots and treat their health issues dealt with before they would proceed further into the interior of the United States. They also were involved in establishing an airstrip there and a stockade where prisoners of war could be held that had been captured. They were also involved in preparing equipment that was going to be shipped south of the border, such as artillery and that, so they could be ready for use south of the border. And they were also involved in other activities such as funeral ceremonies, such as shown here on the bottom right. And if you look very closely at that image, you'll see a lieutenant there, a young George Patton, who was serving in the Mexican Expeditionary Force. And I presume that the soldier that's in the coffin there was one of his. Now, we could go into more depth in that Catherine Stinson, who was the 4th woman pilot in the history of American aviation, would actually train many of the pilots that served in the Punitive Expedition and World War I. Her and her sister, Caroline, I think it was, Stenson. And Catherine was not allowed to serve in the military. Caroline would be granted a license, a pilot's license by the Army Naval and Naval Aeronautics Committee, but she would train the pilots but never flew in missions in combat. But they trained the pilots that they would. And Catherine, in her own case, would marry Miguel Otero of New Mexico, who was a World War I pilot in France. She would end up serving as an ambulance driver in France. She wanted with the Red Cross. She would contract tuberculosis, I believe it was, while she was in France. And she ended up coming to New Mexico and was in one of these sanitariums that Albuquerque was noted for. And they happened to encounter, and Miguel Otero recognizes her. And before you know it, they marry, and she has a family. Will live in Santa Fe. He's buried there, spent the rest of her life here in New Mexico. We get into the World War I period, and we find that we had over 370 Sandoval County veterans that served in the Great War. The memorial actually displays over 154 of their photos. And it's a tribute like no other in the nation. You know, you can literally look them in the eye when you thank them for their service. Shown here on this slide is Frank Lagrange of Bernalillo and Fidencio Olivas of Cuba. They came from all walks of life. Some were cattlemen out there on the prairie, and others were farmers in the Rio Grande Valley and other places. You can see 3 teams of horses there cutting hay. Some were teamsters, moving people and goods around the county. This photo here on the left is taken from Bland, New Mexico. We had a contingent that were miners working in this photos from La Ventana, where there was mining operations there and other places in the Jemez Mountains. And a great many were lumbermen, both in moving logs as shown with the team of horses there in the Jemez Mountains, and the lumberjacks themselves that would be chopping down the trees. So they came from all walks of life, and a great many were also sheep herders, as shown in the bottom left photo. That's taken in Cuba, New Mexico. That's Mr. Eichwald and his wife in that car, which is the first car in Cuba, New Mexico, and some of the sheep herders that worked for him. If you look closely at the photo, you'll notice that the steering wheel is actually on the right-hand side, which indicates that his wife was the driver, not him. This is a period of time in our county where we had many immigrants, German immigrants, French immigrants, Italian immigrants, and so what have you. Shown here is Reginaldo Wagner of Corrales, New Mexico, with his brother Augustine Wagner, who would found Wagner Farms in Corrales. We see Reginaldo's draft registration card there. They were 3rd or 4th generation German immigrants in Sandoval County. We have French immigrants like Albert Mallet, shown here, of Bernalillo. He was a 2nd generation immigrant born here. His father was from France and actually fought in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. Fearful for his family that they would have to go through wars like his ancestors and he had gone through constantly there in Europe, he would emigrate to the United States where they could be raised in peace and safety and not have to deal with the constant wars, only to find that his son, Albert, Uncle Sam would give him a free ticket back to the old world to fight one of those wars. It was kind of a tear-jerking experience going through the archives and coming up with pictures of immigrants that had come from the old world knowing that they had left trying to escape that, only to have our country send them back there. But that's the story behind Albert. He would actually fight on the same battlefield where his father, Pierre, had fought in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. We have an Italian immigrant here, Battista Targetta, also happens to be a resident of Corrales, first generation Italian immigrant. He was born in Italy. Now on his draft card, there's a line that I guess it's line 6 or 7. If you look closely at it, he was supposed to indicate his nationality. He was expected to write in Italian there because he wasn't a citizen yet. Well, that's not what he puts. He writes in, "I want to be an American," in that line, expressing his desire to be an American. Quite moving for me to see that when I came across his draft card. We also have Native Americans that served. There's over 200 who would answer the call and register to serve our country in World War I. However, under the rules of the draft, Native Americans had to be U.S. citizens to serve. Up until 1924, only a small handful were. Those that had, where you had an Anglo that married a Native American, their children, since they were 50% Anglo, they would be allowed, they would have U.S. citizenship. Those that had less than 50% Anglo or Hispanic blood, no. Consequently, although we have large numbers that would register, they were not permitted to serve through no fault of their own. We honor them, all that registered in the memorial, for their willingness and desire, because not all came forward and registered because they didn't have to. The 200 that did, we honor in the memorial. Nonetheless, though, there were exceptions. And we have a few that did in fact serve, like Vidal Sanchez of San Felipe, as shown here later in life. We have Andrew Phillips and George Siawa, Henry and Kenneth Marmoon, all of Laguna Pueblo, that would serve as well. Jose Aguilar of Santo Domingo Pueblo and Key Toledo of the Navajo Nation would serve from Sandoval County in World War I. We also had Juan Fragua of Jemez Pueblo and Guadalupe Fragua, shown here from Jemez Pueblo, that would serve. He was both a bugler and a combat engineer in World War I. As a combat engineer, that was to be at the tip of the spear, so to speak, because one of their responsibilities was to go out into no man's land before an attack with these weapons referred to as bandolier torpedoes, insert them into the barbed wire that the enemy had put up to blast gaps in the wires, so when the attack started, the soldiers had gaps that they could run through the fencing that had been put in place. So that was a very, very risky occupation to be in. And we can tell that from the insignia that's on his collar. Now, if we look at his draft card there, you'll notice that there's an area where they indicate the race, white, etc., and then it gets to Indian, and there's a place where they can check citizen, non-citizen, and you notice that his is checked non-citizen. Now, he was a pupil at the Santa Fe Indian School at the time, so I presume because he had a high school level education, that was one of the exemptions that were granted in allowing them to serve. Now, all that would change after 1924 when they granted citizenship, because we have Native Americans in very large numbers serving in World War II in continuation of their warrior traditions. We also had Black Americans that served. We have two, in fact. Noah Watson, who was from Cañada de Cochiti, that's underneath what is now Cochiti Reservoir in Sandoval County. He was born there, the son of George Watson, who himself was born in 1850 under slavery in North Carolina. After the Civil War was over and he was a free man, he came out west. He would put down roots in Cañada de Cochiti, marry a Hispanic lady from there, Nasario Aragon, I believe it was, and raise his family. Important to note that the Hispanic community here in New Mexico was very open. A black man could come and establish himself and make a living and marry into families, as could a white man. That was not the case back east. We didn't have the racism here that one would encounter in society back east. So many of them were able to establish themselves and become members of the community here and integrate. We also have Reyes Miera of Cuba, who would enlist from Cuba, New Mexico. He was actually born in Albuquerque, and he was working for Justiano Gutierrez, who was a big farmer there in Cuba at the time, so we can tell from his draft card. Now, when he would return from the war, in his golden years, he would be fondly referred to as Don Rey. And many of the Spanish families would turn to him in their hour of need. And I say that because the Spanish children grew up in homes where only Spanish was spoken. And when they went into first grade, they were in serious world of hurt because they couldn't understand the teacher, the instructions, and what have you, and they were failing miserably as a result. So the families would turn to him, ask if they would tutor their children in English, and he gladly did, and many would grow up fondly remembering him for his service to the community as a tutor. And obviously we have a large contingent of Anglo and Hispanics who served from Sandoval County. In this case, we show Genino McCoy of Cuba. His father was Maximiliano McCoy, and his mother was Apolonia Herrera. So he was like 50-50 Anglo and Hispanic in this case. Now interestingly, he would maintain a journal of all his events during World War I. It had been provided by Putney Mercantile Company of Bernalillo and Peña Blanca. Would hand it to the draftees, and his survives. And it gives us a window into their lives there during World War I. We can see from the entry made on the center section of his journal there on the slide that he entered the front lines, the trenches, on, I believe it was July 28th. And then 3 days later, he would exit the trenches on July 31st. And then 3 days later, he was back in the trenches in August. Why is that important? Well, the Army was rotating the service members in and out of the trenches. Hollywood would have us believe that they were in the trenches for weeks and months on end, suffering the conditions of the trenches. That's not untrue. No, they were 3 days in the trenches, 3 days in the rear, 3 days back in the trenches, and 3 days back in the rear, to make conditions survivable for them. They were looking out for the interests of the soldiers. All shown here is an actual draft letter sent to Benislao Gabaldon, who was from Dominguez. That's out near Cabezon, along the Rio Puerto in western Sandoval County. It's the same form that was used throughout the entire nation, whether you lived in Idaho or in Georgia, or Maine, or California. They would the local draft board, the county draft board, would enter the individual's name in there, the date they had to report, and then they would put their stamp, in this case, the Sandoval County draft board on it. And this is extremely rare to come across one of these. But that's an actual draft notice that they would receive. Now, here in the West, it had a far different impact than, say, back east. And I say that in that counties back east are fairly small, and especially even in Texas, they're very small counties. New Mexico, they're large counties. But across the board, they were given 7 days to report. Well, that was fine here in Sandoval County. That was fine for the draftees that were from Bernalillo, where the board was located, or Placitas, Algodones, the adjoining communities, because that meant they had 7 days to party before they had to report. Now, if you were living out there in Dominguez by Cabezon, that's a whole nother story. It'd take 2.5 days, 3 days to get the notice on horseback out there to them. Then they had to fetch the individual from out on the prairie, wherever they were with the herds of sheep or cattle, get back to the house, maybe have enough time to throw on a clean shirt, jump on the wagon for another 2 to 3 day ride to Bernalillo, so they would not be considered AWOL. So in these rural communities out in the remote parts of the county, that was quite an ordeal to not end up being considered AWOL, because they had to hustle to meet the reporting time requirements. Now, at that point, it was off to training, and there was, I believe there were 16 cantonment or training camps across the United States. The vast majority of the Sandoval County soldiers would end up at Camp Funkston in Fort Riley, Kansas. A smaller group thereof would end up at Camp Pike in Arkansas, and yet an even smaller group would end up in Camp Kearney near San Diego, California. So the vast majority would begin their service in Camp Funkston. Shown here on this slide is Ezequiel Sandoval from Casa Salazar, which is in the far southwest corner of the county, and Benjamin Harrison of Bernalillo. They would arrive by train. That was the principal mode of transportation. You can see them arriving there at Camp Funkston, and the sergeants in uniform waiting for them. First order of business was for them to be issued uniforms, and then they would be asked to pack up their stuff and given the opportunity to ship it back home. You can see American Express Company in business back then providing that service. They would have no need from their civilian clothes going forward. Pictured there is Alberto Baca of Peña Blanca. In addition, they would get issued their dog tags. They were little round discs back then. They felt kind of like aluminum, and they would just stamp their names on them as they went through the line and their service number. Depicted there is Felipe Valencia of La Ventana, and Elias Casados, and Rafael Archebeck of La Jara. They would also then get processed for pay and benefits. Now, the monthly base pay for a sergeant was $39 in World War I. For a corporal was $30. A private first class was $27, and for a private, which the vast majority were privates, was $22 a month. Now, that came though with all their clothing, their uniforms, their footgear, weapon, all the ammunition they could shoot, their medical care, their room and board, their transportation, wherever they needed to be. And if they were in the cavalry, they received the horse and the feed for the horse. By contrast, a forest ranger back in 1917, 1918 earned $75 a month. But out of that, they had to pay their room and board. They had to pay for any medical expenses they had, their clothing, their uniforms they had to pay for. They were even expected to provide 3 horses. The government did not, Forest Service did not provide them. They had to provide them. Horses were expensive. And they had to feed the horses out of their paycheck. Government didn't provide the feed. So on balance, a private earned about the same after all these expenses as a forest ranger back in 1917. The government would also, for the first time, provide life insurance for the service members. And shown here is Henino McCoy's life insurance policy that it took out. You can see it's for the amount of $5,000. But what's kind of extraordinary when you look at it is that the cost was a monthly allotment of $28. Now here you have a private earning $22 a month, and the life insurance was $28. So we have to hope and assume that they provided them with some kind of allowance in the top, in addition to the base pay, to help pay the cost of the life insurance, because it wasn't cheap. But he chose to take it out for his benefit of his family if something should happen to him. You know, they would go to bed that night and thinking it was all a dream. Days earlier, they had been here in Sandoval County, in La Jara, in Cuba, in Peña Blanca, Bernalillo, Corrales, San Isidro, Jemez, wherever they were from here in the county, and only to be awakened by they would be awakened by reveille that following morning, and then they realized that, no, this wasn't a dream. They were actually in the army, and they would have to proceed to learn how to march and put on their uniforms properly and so forth. Here in this slide, we have an example of where they're out at the rifle range, and you can see they're holding their mess kits there. That's what they ate out of. They had to carry that with them at all times because they would first sanitize it before their meal, eat, and then wash it after, and to be ready for the next meal time. And regardless whether they were in camp, eating in one of the buildings, or out in the field at the rifle range, they would eat their meals out of those mess kits. Shown here is Jose Guadalupe Rivera of Corrales. I highlight him because if you look closely at his uniform, he has a sharpshooter badge. That was extremely rare in World War I for a service member to earn that. It's what we would call a sniper today, one shot, one kill. 1 in 500 were good enough to earn the sharpshooter badge, and he did. As for housing, it was a big tent city at the beginning, as shown here, and they would then eventually move into large open bay barracks. Many of us who would later go to Fort Riley, serve there, and all the other forts, often thought of those barracks as World War II barracks, and I was just kind of tickled to see that they weren't, in doing this research for this memorial, that those weren't World War II barracks. They were actually World War I barracks that I myself served in as a Vietnam era veteran. Now, Camp Funston would become ground zero for the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. Service members who were being brought back from Europe to help train the soldiers there would bring it with them from Europe. And it would spread like wildfire through the ranks. And it was a killer. The doctors had never seen anything like it. And it would, over the course of 2 months, it just ran rampant there. So on top of everything else, no longer having beans and chili in their diet as they had here in Sandoval County, and pulled away and living in these tents and what have you there at Camp Funston, they had to deal with this flu epidemic that cut through there. And there's cases, and obviously it was not contained to there. It would spread out through the entire nation. And there's some soldiers who would return from the war only to find that their family had all died from the flu, their wife, their children. Then it was training, infantry training for all. They would learn how to rush enemy positions, their bayonet training for hand-to-hand combat. They would learn how to dig trenches. They learned how to dig sleeping compartments into the sides of trenches for when they were serving in the trenches. They all underwent this basic training. From there was a group that would go off for cavalry training. As shown here, we have 2 soldiers who were cavalrymen, Horacio Montoya Peñablanco, shown with his horse, and Leonardo Trujillo from Guadalupe, another, what is now a ghost town near Cabezon. He's an interesting individual in that I guess it was 1993, there was a book published on the great cowboys of the Southwest, and one of them was Bruce King, former governor of the state of New Mexico. And the author asked him, well, in his opinion, who were the 3 greatest cowboys of all time? The first name out of his mouth was Leonardo Trujillo, shown here, in his opinion, as one of the greatest cowboys, who also happened to be a veteran, World War I veteran. We also had those that went into the artillery, like Escapula Armijo of Corrales. Now, the artillery had some very, very large guns in World War II. They had sizes that were as large as 15 inches, the caliber of the barrel. That is massive. Many of us are familiar with the battleships from World War II, the Iowa class, like the USS Missouri, USS Iowa, and so forth. And they had 16-inch guns. And these that they used in World War I were just a hair smaller. And they were firing these massive guns to help demolish the trenches and German fortifications. They also had the smaller artillery, as shown there in the picture as well, that was horse-drawn. Then there was chemical warfare training. That was a constant hazard in World War I. You can see them in mass going through the gas. And it wasn't just the soldiers that had to learn how to effectively don and maintain their masks, but they had to be able to put the masks on the horses as well, because pretty much all the horsepower was horses. It wasn't trucks to move equipment and supplies around. So you had to be able to put a mask on the horses, and the canines that they had with the Army, they had their own special masks because the gas was a tremendous hazard. We had many that died from it. In the case of Thomas Rivera here, he chose to take this official photograph with the mask on, which I guess it saved his life on so many occasions. He felt he was obliged to do that. And there was other soldier duties. There was KP as shown here, peeling potatoes. There's laundry duty. They all had to do their own clothes. Guard duty, like on the right-hand side, where we have two guards that appear to be outside of a dentist tent, which I suspect that wasn't to keep people out of the tent. It was to keep the patient in till the dentist was finished with them. And we have like motorcycle troops there that they would shuttle the soldiers around the camp in the sidecar. Now, one of our veterans, Jose Leon Herrera of La Jara, was so fond of it, he brought back one of those motorcycles with him, and it was known to be seen up and down the highways and byways around Cuba and New Mexico in that motorcycle. We had a number of casualties. At least 69 would be World War I combat casualties. Varying degrees of injury, some severely, some slightly. Some are shown as wounded being in a German hospital, some wounded degree undetermined. And they came from across the board, from Peña Blanca, Placitas, Bernalillo, Casa Salazar, Cabezon, Jemez, La Jara. Every community had someone that was injured in the war. And we had two that would be missing in action, never to be found again. You know, considering the size of the artillery that was being used, if it struck where your position in the trench, there would be nothing left to identify. When they would pass, there was a tradition where the White House would send a letter to the families of the deceased World War I veteran. This is a letter to the family of Genino McCoy of Cuba, New Mexico, from President Ronald Reagan, thanking the family for their father's service in the Great War. We have other letters as well. In this case, this one's addressed to Andres Mares of Peña Blanca. This is from President Bill Clinton, congratulating him on the occasion of his 101st birthday. We've not found another of that age, so we have every reason to believe he was the last surviving Sandoval County World War I veteran, and quite possibly the last surviving World War veteran for the entire state of New Mexico. He would die in 1997.